I'm Matt Bernard, author of Victorian Summer, The Historic Houses of Belle Haven Park, Greenwich, Connecticut. My passion for architecture inspired me to research the historic houses of Belle Haven. The project was inspired by the hope that I could take this archive and memorialize it in one place for future generations. The land that would become Belle Haven Park, Greenwich, Connecticut, was exquisite pasture, set high above the waterline, like an overturned spoon. Townspeople would go there to picnic under the ancient oak trees, splash their feet in the shallow springs, gazing every now and then at the panoramic views of Long Island Sound. Horseneck, Field Point, as the Belle Haven Peninsula was historically known, was long the domain of Abraham Meade, a Revolutionary War captain, farmer, and gifted potter. Later, the peninsula was divided roughly in half. Nelson Bush owned the farm that became much of Belle Haven Park, and Oliver Meade and Nelson Meade the rest. But the Bush and Meade farmland was too pretty to sit undeveloped for long. It was all about to change. In 1882, a big sale occurred when four men operating as the Belle Haven Land Company paid Bush and Meade heirs $46,000 for the original 200 acres of what would become Belle Haven Park. The four were Robert Bruce, a cotton merchant, Nathaniel Witherall, a mining speculator and smelter, A. Foster Higgins, head of the insurance giant Johnson & Higgins, and Thomas Mayo, a commercial ship captain. The 1884 sales brochure described the proposed development as such. The property on which Belle Haven is situated has recently passed into the hands of a small company of capitalists whose intention is to develop it into a residence park, and it will spare no expense to make it in all respects an unequal as a place of residence for summer or permanent location. At the height of the Gilded Age, far from the grit and grime of New York, Boston, or Philadelphia, America's wealthiest families began to congregate in the towns of Newport, Southampton, Bar Harbor, and Tuxedo Park. Today, few people would recognize that a secluded Connecticut peninsula called Belle Haven was mentioned in the same breath as those communities. Successful American magazines sketched the Belle Haven of 1902 as a non-parallel spot, surpassing in beauty while equaling in elegance the pet of the fashionable world, Newport, and outshining Tuxedo in brilliance and gaiety. Rapid urbanization had created an interest in city planning, which in turn had provoked a craze for municipal park design. The greatest of the new city greens was Frederick Law Olmsted's Central and Prospect Parks, constructed through the Civil War and completed in the early 1870s. The Belle Haven Land Company hired Olmsted to design the new residential park, with the same lyric curves and loops, the same gas street lamps and elm trees lining smoothly graded roads with which Olmsted had graced Central Park. That December, workers broke ground for Belle Haven's first houses. 3 atypically Spartan Queen Annes on Mayo Avenue, the first of Belle Haven streets to be settled. The cottages, though beautifully crafted, were modest by the standard of houses that would soon rise in Belle Haven. But these houses were quintessentially American. One feature that made them so was the veranda or piazza, that casually elegant extension of the old country porch. The Victorian-era veranda, wide and long, was outfitted with tables, chairs, and hammocks. The Belle Haven verandas were exceptional beauties, with varnished wooden decking, fancy light fixtures, and decorative balustrades with turned posts. They wrapped around a house on 2 sides, and often 3. On hot summer evenings, the dinner table would be set there, under a rounded gazebo-like portion that was always located on the southwestern corner of the cottage. Prior to 1910, very few Belle Haven houses were built without a veranda. After that time, when the European influence came heavily into American country house design, utilizing stucco and masonry, Porches and verandas were replaced with terraces, sharpening the division between indoors and outdoors. Belle Haven Land Company partner Robert Bruce built cottages as investments. He didn't live in Belle Haven, but in a stone mansion near the center of town, overlooking Greenwich Harbor. Nathaniel Witherall and Thomas Mayo, however, lived opposite each other on Mayo Avenue. Witherall built his house first, a dark and rather foreboding shingle style. Mayo's massive Tudor revival and almost equally massive stable went up the next year, directly across the street. Witherall must have admired it, because within 6 years, he moved his original shingle-style cottage to what would become Walsh Lane, 1 block south, and built a Tudor of his own. Several of Belle Haven's earliest houses were Queen Anne's. The Queen Anne, though it enjoyed great popularity in the 1880s, was considered a vernacular style. Belle Haven's Queen Anne's were among the best of the best. This is largely because they did not evolve from builders using pattern books, but rather from the hand of skilled architects. One lovely example of the Queen Anne style is the still extant Snug Harbor, built in 1886, also on Mayo Avenue. The Queen Anne's elevated cousin was the shingle style. The shingle style's forms were simpler, less frilly than those of the Queen Anne, and its scale was grander. And this first modern American house style proved adaptable. Curiously enough, both Queen Anne and shingle style are said to have descended from a single dwelling, the Watt Sherman House in Newport, constructed in 1875. Designed by Henry Hobson Richardson, the Watt Sherman House's broad, deep gables, cleverly patterned shingles, and airy floor plan served as the prototype for many others, including McKim Meaden White's great shingle-style buildings of the 1880s. The first noteworthy shingle-style house in Belle Haven was Lawson Cottage, constructed in 1888. Designed by Bruce Price, the primary architect of Tuxedo Park, the cottage rose from its mound where Mayo Avenue and Otter Rock Drives intersected in a series of dramatic cones and ridges, and was encircled by a wide piazza. Several Belle Havenites made their millions by exploiting the country's natural resources. Another set of Belle Haven men took raw materials and made things. Charles Moore made steel machine tools for building and maintaining railroads. One of the most interesting stories was about a house that still exists on Mayo Avenue, a grand Queen Anne Victorian called the Hutchins Cottage, that was purchased in 1906 by a Mr. Green from Chicago. He was a lawyer and was asked by a number of bakeries throughout the country to represent them. He started with one, and numerous others followed. He got the idea that he should represent all these people, all these bakers, by creating a conglomerate, which, fast forward 100 years, became Nabisco. Mr. Green, once he had created this conglomerate of bakers, moved his headquarters to New York from Chicago, and of course bought a summer house in Belle Haven. The Brooklyn Eagle and Brooklyn Society magazine monitored the comings and goings of the cottagers who would relocate from Park Slope, Brooklyn Heights, and Prospect Park to spend the summer in Belle Haven. In Belle Haven, there existed in dense concentration houses by the elite house designers of the late Victorian period. McKim Meaden White, Peabody and Stearns, Lamb and Rich, Bruce Price, C.P.H. Gilbert, Wilson Eyre, who founded House and Garden magazine, Edward Kendall, Boring and Tilton, who did multiple houses as well as the casino, and Harry T. Lindenberg. The single most interesting discovery during my research was unearthing what is considered the only McKim Meaden White house ever built from the ground up in Greenwich. It was built in 1885 for a family from Brooklyn, and it was very much in keeping with the firm's very early original houses, shingle-style houses, such as a group that still exists in Montauk, one of which Dick Cavett owned and has made a documentary on. That house was indicative of what happened in Belle Haven over the years, which is the evolution of lifestyles and architecture. That beautiful shingle-style house only lasted about 15 years. It was torn down in 1906 and replaced by a Grand Georgian on the same site. They retained the gazebo. And we found that original house by reviewing the old Sanborn Atlas maps, which were fire atlases that were produced that showed all the original foundations and outbuilding foundations on each lot in each town. By researching those maps, we could tell which houses' foundations didn't match the current or the former foundation. And that's how we guessed that there was another house on that site. Fortunately, we found a cache of Scientific America magazines which documented the original house that McKim, Mead & White designed. We did have the original owner's name, and we were able to match those two up. In the 1880s, Belle Haven's elegance was fairly casual. The decorating had a dark and overstuffed look. Animal skins and heads, elephant tusks, silk wall hangings, vases and feathers, and flowers and ferns. Adding to the resort atmosphere were three fashionable inns: the homestead, the mansion house, and especially the large and elegant Kent House. In 1892, Boring, Tilton, and Mellon's shingle-style casino, or clubhouse, was finished on the park's waterfront public grounds, giving Belle Haven a social hub. The original amenities that were included in the offering brochure were a first for the Northeast, particularly for Greenwich. Amenity packages were considered something new and interesting. Recreational aspects of these communities were just starting to emerge. In Belle Haven's case, sailing, the waterfront, tennis had become a rage with the construction of the Newport Casino a few years earlier. Tuxedo Park, which was an inland resort built around lakes, was concurrently built with similar amenities, the most important of which were bathing facilities and a casino. And a casino wasn't considered a gambling casino, but a social club where people could congregate in the neighborhood for dances, playing billiards, and just relaxing after a day at the beach. Typically, there wasn't food service. Minor cooking facilities were included, and they were purely seasonal. This was at best, 3 months a year resort. People came in June, July, and August. By September, they were gone. And even within those 3 months, many of the most prosperous residents had multiple summer houses. They would go to the Berkshires. They would go to Elberon in New Jersey. They would go to Newport. They would even go up to Maine. They would have private rail cars that would take them to their other houses along with their staff. These houses had numerous staff, and they would pack up and leave Belle Haven for one of their other homes before returning in the fall to their winter houses, mostly in New York and Brooklyn. And suddenly, the wider world took notice of the colony. The magazines, Country Life in America, House and Garden, Town and Country, all featured the new Greenwich estates. The Times first rhapsodized about the residence park's beauty and vivacity in 1896. It was in the early 1900s that Belle Haven began its gradual transformation from a Victorian summer colony to a year-round neighborhood, with their requisite boilers and water plants. The architecture reflected that change. It moved towards permanence of attitude, with classical columns, Great Georgian pediments, and Beaux-Arts flourishes throughout. Strictly speaking, the Victorian age ended with Queen Victoria's death in 1901, but historians often extend it through to World War I, when a new bold phase of modernity took hold. This is not to say that mansion building ceased in Greenwich. It continued into the early 1930s in spite of the Great Depression. Quarry Farm, built in 1929, was a Gothic manor house designed by Frank Forster, who was lauded for his French provincial country palaces. Later, under the ownership of tobacco heiress Nancy Reynolds, it would become one of the great estates in Connecticut, complete with aviary and zoo. Unfortunately, the Depression came. These weekend and summer houses quickly became burdensome albatrosses for many of the upper tier residents who had lost fortunes during the stock market crash. Many chose to sell their summer houses and retreated back to New York. Others, such as the people who gave us the picture of our house, sold their Park Avenue apartment, moved out to Greenwich, and used the house year-round. And that period helped fast-track the evolution of Belle Haven from a summer resort to year-round residency. The enactment of the income tax and the estate tax, in conjunction with the Depression and then World War II, really brought an end to the Gilded Age of Belle Haven. The transition that followed changed the community completely. Many of the original mansions were just albatrosses. They contained 10 and 15 bedrooms, many on the third floor. There were outbuildings, massive kitchen gardens, and the cost to maintain these homes was extravagant. The Depression made it very difficult for many of those individuals to maintain those homes. Residential design was now influenced by the modern aesthetic of the Bauhaus movement, which had lost its tie to the ornamental and craftsman traditions of the Victorian era. The cottages of Belle Haven had been swept into the past. There was still demand for some of the grand waterfront properties in the park, but its shine had clearly faded. Many of the great houses had been lost to demolition in the Depression's aftermath, and others, the victims of changing tastes of the post-war baby boomers, were torn down and their grounds subdivided and replaced with post-war ranch houses and capes. Today, there is a Belle Haven Renaissance. The 1980s brought a newfound interest in the neighborhood by many investment banking executives seeking houses that had a sense of history, scale, and stature. Later in the 1990s, as the formation of hedge funds exploded, Greenwich became the epicenter of that new world of extreme wealth that in many ways mirrored the economies of scale that were found at the turn of the century. A reset had occurred. One might say that the community had come full circle. A transformation had commenced. Many of the new residents buying in Belle Haven have created new fortunes that in many ways mimic the generation of the Gilded Age industrialists that had established the community in the previous century. These new residents are now hiring renowned architects to renovate and recreate cottages for a new Gilded Age that has returned to Belle Haven.